Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. My name is Chris Weuve. This is STARFLEET Tactical. I'm here by myself, except for the ever-talented Lissa, who is behind the scenes. She is doing her thing as always. Let's see. I've told people I'll try to tell them what the T-shirt is. So the T-shirt is super easy, barely an inconvenience. That actually kind of describes today's episode. I decided that it was about time to we've done a couple of things that have been very maritime focused, right? I always say that this show is usually naval history with some science fiction flavoring, or science fiction with some naval history flavoring. And in this particular case, we've done a couple of things that were very maritime oriented with some science fiction flavoring. So let's do some science fiction and let's just do some Star Trek for a couple of episodes. And so we're going to talk about a fan favorite, the BELKNAP class strike cruiser, a favorite of mine as well. It's a design from way back when. And it turned out that this episode sort of put itself together in the way that a lot of episodes do. At first I go, I wonder if there's enough to talk about that. And then I think about it some more and I go, yeah, there's a full show's worth of stuff. Because when I sort of pull in things that are related to it and sort of explanatory stuff, etc., there's a full show's worth of stuff. Boy, that's beginning to look like it could be a kind of a long show. Maybe I can split it in two. Yeah, I can split it in two. Today I made the decision to split it in three. So it's going to be done in three parts. The next three episodes are going to be about the BELKNAP. The first one's going to be about the BELKNAP itself. The second one is going to be about the ASCENSION class dreadnought and dreadnoughts in Star Trek in general and other weird things that have three engines. And then the last one's going to be about the ATHABASKA class exploratory cruiser, which is what happens when a Knox class frigate and a BELKNAP class cruiser love each other very much. This is what you get. So in any event, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my slides and let's go ahead and talk about it. But first, the obligatory admin slide. So the rest of July, I expect to be around. I'm actually going to go to a game convention next week. There is a small possibility I may decide to stay late enough to not be back in time. But I think what I'm going to do, because I'm expecting to finish my slides for tomorrow, I think what I'm going to do is just go to the game convention and then drive back. If I leave at 3, I'll get back around 6, and then I'll be able to do the show. So I think that's what I'm going to do. In August, I'm expecting that there's one day. I may miss one of the shows in August. I'm not sure. But then starting on the 22nd of August, for the rest of August and maybe early September, I'm going to be out because I'll be recovering from surgery and I will not have the spoons to put together episodes. So there's a bunch of stuff in the queue, but the next 3 things in the queue, or the next 2 after tonight, are variations on the BELKNAP. I pulled a lot of images off the web like I always do. They are the property of the original people who put it together. I wasn't particularly good this episode about tagging stuff. I did try to tag some of it. Sourcing is kind of an issue for this particular topic, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So that's one of the things that, I tried to say where stuff came from, but there might be some stuff that I didn't get quite right on that. Okay, so here's the agenda. We already did the admin. We're going to talk about sources in just a second. Then I'm going to spend for today, I'm going to talk about the BELKNAP, sort of the real world history. Where did this design come from? Where was it published, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm going to talk about, why BELKNAP. It's a dude's name. It's actually 2 dudes' name. There's been U.S. Navy ships named after that. Let's talk about some of that stuff. And then we're going to talk about the in-universe context. Why did Starfleet build this ship according to the lore? Why did they build this ship? And then finally, we're going to take a look at the ship in detail. And then, like I said, we'll look at the ASCENSION class dreadnought next episode. The episode after that, the ATHABASKA class exploratory cruiser is what they're calling it. And so there you can see the silhouettes of the 3. It may not be immediately apparent, but that ATHABASKA, the primary hull is basically a Knox class frigate. A Knox class is basically what eventually turned into the Miranda. It's got hangars in the back of the saucer and sort of built up area in the back of the saucer for the Miranda. They then extended that aft. And so for that episode, we're going to talk about the history of the Nox and sort of look at the blueprints for the Nox and look at the blueprints for the Miranda. So sources. A lot of the artwork comes from a guy on DeviantArt named Adrasil. That's his sign on there. He's not producing new stuff. The last notice that he put up was from a couple of years ago saying that he had a second heart attack and he just didn't think he was going to be able to do any more artwork. But the artwork he's done is really fantastic. And so all the drawings that you see, like the stuff on the previous slide, was all from him. The originator appears to be Todd Guenther, but David Schmidt, who did, and Todd Guenther did a lot of the MasterCom Data Center stuff. And he did Starship. I think he did MasterCom. He did, or maybe, no, that was Chris Wallace. I'm sorry. But he did the Starship Design book, sort of magazine. David Schmidt did a bunch of stuff, and he did, I think, Starfleet Prototype. Maybe one of those. But he did some stuff, and some people have accredited him with it. But Guenther included it in 1984, and I think the earliest for David Schmidt was like 1991. It's shown up in the Ships of the Line calendar. The bottom image, the bottom two images, are both from the Ships of the Line calendar, which sort of seems to imply that maybe it's canon now, kind of, sort of, to the degree that thing is. There's lots of wiki information on it. It's included in the FASA Star Trek game, in the sort of the online extension of that game, the Star Trek Starfleet Tactical Combat, or Star Trek Starship Tactical Combat Simulator. So there, people have done stats for it, et cetera, and histories and the rest. And of course, it's all over the Cygnus X1 website, where you can get blueprints and all these books, and there's PDFs and there's everything, et cetera. And Cygnus X1 was that, and the DeviantArt website were sort of the keys to making this happen. But you know, the thing about sourcing is, boy, the fans don't make it easy. So these are two different books called Starfleet Prototype. One is clearly sort of based on the other one. They have entirely different content. So David Schmidt did the first one. Chris Wallace did the second one. Chris Wallace is the same guy who did the Ships of Starfleet books. And they're entirely different in the inside. But they've got all the same information on the outside. And the fact that a lot of the different sources use in-universe publication dates. No, it wasn't built, it didn't come out in 2290. I know it didn't come out in 2290. They make it hard to sort of track some of this stuff. So I will freely admit, I just at some point decided it wasn't worth the effort crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, because I could spend time finding it cool images of starships and putting them in the slide deck so that we can all get in touch with our inner 12-year-old, or I could spend time trying to track down which came first and what the real date is and all that other stuff. And hey, if you guys want to do that, that's great. Go for it. It's all on the Cygnus X1 website, and you can figure it out. I just decided, and likewise, I didn't go through and figure out, like is there a consensus on how many phasers it has? Because I just didn't go there. Because I don't think that that's the most interesting part of it. You can tell whatever story you want, because there's no canon description of this ship. The closest thing we have to anything that looks like it canonizes it is those photos from the calendar. That's it. Other than that, it's never showed up in the show. A lot of people have done stats for it, but it's not actually something that we've got, something that we can point to and say, yes, that's the official answer on it. So I don't see any need to sort of jump through those hoops. Okay, so this is what I think is the history of the design, but I only put a little bit of effort in it. It appears to originally come from I think it's called Starfleet Design. I may be I may be getting the title wrong. The subtitle's like a forum for space power or something like that. Come to think of it, I think I do have that title wrong. I think it's Starship Design. But it was done by Todd Guenther in 1984. It's sort of an interesting magazine. It's got ads for sensor systems and ads for phasers in it and stuff like that. It reads like a defense periodical, in that it's got various vendors are trying to sell their wares. It was there was originally an idea for something called the USS Decatur. I'll show you a picture of that coming forward. And it was an expansion of that idea into the movie era, as near as I can tell. I think the Decatur idea predates it, and I think what ended up happening was Guenther took that and turned it into a movie era thing. I think. I could be totally wrong about that. It was immediately picked up by a bunch of other sources. A bunch of people decided they really liked it, and it showed up in Starfleet Prototype. It showed up in Ships of the Starfleet, and showed up people did blueprints on it. It's all over the place, and it really is kind of a fan favorite. So this is an illustration from the book, from the periodical, the design periodical by Guenther, and it shows this is the sort of things that's in there. They're talking about the Ascension class dreadnought and the BELKNAP, and about how the design for warp nacelle placement changed over time. So for their dreadnought, the top was the original proposed nacelle design. The bottom is what they went with for the Federation class dreadnought, and then for the Ascension class, which is based upon the BELKNAP, you've got the design at the bottom, which is the classic BELKNAP design where it connects on the bottom. And I'm going to talk about why it connects on the bottom in a few slides. So let's do a quick little refresher on the warp core, because this is going to be important later on. Early on, the very first thing you have that looks like a blueprint is in the making of Star Trek. It's just a little illustration that shows sort of an internal cutaway of the ship. And it does not have anything that looks like a warp core in the secondary hull. Franz Joseph designs. Franz Joseph does blueprints, and he does the tech manual. And he does not include anything that looks like a warp core in the secondary hull. It's all contained in the nacelles. Now, and that's for a long time, that's what it was. It was just all contained in the nacelles. There was some other weirdnesses in there, like, for instance, the warp engines work by sucking in space-time in the front and spitting space-time out the back. Not exactly what Sternbach and Okuda decided to go with when they wrote the tech manual for Next Generation. But a lot of people, and I'm one of them, kind of concluded that the real purpose of the secondary hull is to maintain all the stuff associated with the star drive. And so after the motion picture introduced the idea that there was this vertical shaft and a horizontal thing going back to the engines, et cetera, a lot of people came up with the idea of retrofitting that to the original classic Enterprise design. And you see a couple of illustrations here. I did an episode on it a few years ago that talked about the various different ways you do it. At the top, you've got one that has a warp core horizontal structure that goes along the top of the secondary hull. And the one below that has one that goes, it's that cylinder thing that it goes right along the axis of rotation of the secondary hull. It's right behind the main deflector. And oh, by the way, originally that was not labeled main deflector. It was labeled main sensor. It became the navigational deflector later, and at some point that turned into Sternbach and Okuda giving a long explanation about how the navigational deflector works and about how it's really a subspace device. It's effectively kind of like it acts like a third warp nacelle, except it's a warp nacelle that specifically sort of focuses its field in the head of the ship to sort of push stuff out of the way. And so that's something that got added on later. I kind of like the designs where the idea is that they put that warp core right down the middle so that it's feeding right into the dish. And I'll also point out that in the original show, the original Enterprise, if you look at where the struts for the nacelles come into that secondary hull, if you just draw a line and extend it forward, they cross at the center line of that axis of rotation. They cross right along the center. So it makes sense to me to put all of that complex right in the center. And then if you look, you'll notice on the motion picture Enterprise, the warp nacelles connect a lot higher in the secondary hull, right where they move the warp core to. So I think that's kind of how that all works out. That's going to become important later when we start talking about where the piping all is for the BELKNAP, and it's especially going to get important when we start talking about the ATHABASKA and the Nox and the Miranda. Think about where that warp core has to be for the Miranda, or where it could be for the Miranda class. That's an interesting question as to where exactly you would put it. A lot of designs out there, when people do cool designs, they don't think about the internal piping. They don't think about, okay, we'll just stick the engines on random locations. It's like, okay, if you put it there, it means you're going to be running warp plasma through the people tank. Don't run warp plasma through the people tank if you can avoid it. Keep the antimatter as far away from the people as you can. If for no other reason, it makes it difficult to jettison the part that has the antimatter if you have to. Think about those things. I mean, I would basically argue that what I see in sort of the classic Star Trek design is you've got a star drive section that is designed to be a star drive section, and then a people part that's kind of added on, right? If you think about it, it kind of makes sense in that regard. Oh, we don't want the people part to be really touching, getting in the way of the star drive part. So we'll just sort of hang it off the corner, hang it off the end here so that it's not interfering with all the rest of it, with the star drive part, and you don't have to run all the plasma piping through the people part. And so I would argue that if you're designing something in the Star Trek universe, you should start with the star drive and figure out how all that stuff works, and then figure out where you're going to add the people part on afterwards. Probably. I can also tell a story if you want to about how, if you go back to the early ships, a lot of the early ships, they hadn't yet come into that design ethos. Over a period of time, they sort of became more modular and adopted that design ethos. By the time you get to the Sovereign, a couple of things have happened. Starfleet's had another couple of 100 years experience in how to deal with antimatter, et cetera. And they're a lot more confident that even in a battle situation where somebody's specifically doing damage to your ship, that they can keep everything under control. And so they're more willing to mix everything together. The Sovereign class does not look like any part of it detaches from another part of it. And so I think in that case, they sort of said, you know what, that was a nice to have, but there are certain things that we're trying to achieve with this warship design. And as a result of that, we are going to forego this idea of having the extreme separation that we had before, and we're going to sort of cram it all together again. But they're just much better about it, so they feel better about being willing to do that sort of stuff, I think, right? I haven't said it in a while, but remember, my thinking on Star Trek, because you can prove anything you want by, some writer somewhere wrote some dialogue that said XYZ, even if XYZ doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I base my thinking on this on logical extrapolations of Sternbach and Okuda, with some heavy influence from Pat Doyle and Andy Presby, both of whom have been on the show, obviously. And so, the three of us talk about this stuff, and we talk about what we read in Sternbach and Okuda, and so that's sort of how I put all this stuff together, is through that. And some of the stuff that appears on screen just sort of gets filtered aside because you cannot make it consistent. You cannot make everything consistent. You just can't. So I tried to come up with something that is internally consistent within itself and extrapolate accordingly. Okay, so let's talk about some real world history now. So going back to the US Navy, the Belknap is listed in many sources as a heavy cruiser, but in many sources it's listed as a strike cruiser. Strike cruiser is a real world term. It was used by the United States Navy in the 1970s, going into the 1980s. The idea was that we would build a large guided missile cruiser that would have an extra large number of like Tomahawk cells. The idea is that this was going to carry Tomahawk and air defense missiles in the form of SM-2 and anti-ship missiles in the form of Harpoon. And it was going to carry a bigger gun. It was going to carry an 8-inch gun. So we developed this 8-inch gun, and then we just sort of like didn't do anything with it. In fact, the last time we were looking at an 8-inch gun, we didn't even go back to the previous design for an 8-inch gun. And it was an entirely new design. It wasn't just, is my understanding, it wasn't just taking an old design off the shelf. We designed a new 8-inch gun. We never did anything with it. And it's totally lost to history, except there's like 1 or 2 pieces of artwork, like this illustration here. And if you look at the shield for the Aegis System Program Office, the ship that's on that shield doesn't match any actual ship in the US Navy. It's the strike cruiser design that they came up with, that they never built. So it is enshrined in history. It's enshrined in that Aegis patch, but other than that, it's gone. So that's what a strike cruiser was. And strike cruiser is a term that shows up in Star Trek a lot. There's a lot of things actually that the US Navy has totally forgot existed, but Star Trek remembers that the US Navy talked about it at one point because it got it, and it ended up in Star Trek. So Bob says that he has to give the any Aegis reference a big thumbs up after working on Tomahawk for so many years. I didn't know you were a Tomahawk guy. Let's talk about that at some point. Okay, so who is Belknap? Belknap's a guy's name. So the first Belknap was Rear Admiral George Eugene Belknap, who died in 1903, and he had a destroyer named after him. He had a distinguished career. He was commanding officer at the Asiatic Squadron. But other than that, most of what he did was exploration. He explored some trenches and found some seafloor features, like one of the forget which trench it was. It wasn't the Marianas Trench, but it was something else. He did a lot of exploration stuff. And he had a destroyer named after him, the USS Belknap DD-251, which I think looks to me like it's one of those 4 Piper destroyers, which I'm going to do a show on at some point, another show on it. And so that ship was a World War I destroyer. I can't remember what happened to it. And then there was a cruiser that was actually named after both Rear Admiral Belknaps, the father, who was on the previous side, and the son, who lived from 1871 to 1959. Now, he served in World War I and the Spanish-American War and stuff like that. He retired in, I had it and I didn't put it on the slide. I want to say he retired like pre-World War II. Retired in like the early 1930s or something like that. And the cruiser Belknap was named after him. The cruiser Belknap is an important ship. The reason why it's an important ship is that it had a really bad day on the 22nd of November of 1975. It started out, it was originally going to be a guided missile frigate. When it was first commissioned, it was guided missile frigate, but in June of 1975, there was the great reclassification where everything that it used to be that a frigate was something larger than a destroyer, smaller than a cruiser in US usage, but we were the only ones who did that. And so we decided to go with what the rest of the world was doing, and they were calling frigates, that ships smaller than destroyers were called frigates. Now, the frigate, of course, is a term from the Age of Sail. It continued in the post-Age of Sail era up through the 1870s or so. So you had these steamships that also had sails that were called frigates. At one point, the most powerful ship in the world was the frigate HMS Warrior, and they called it a frigate because it only had one gun deck. And they said, this doesn't make sense that this is a frigate. It's a battleship. Why are we calling it a frigate? Does one gun deck mean anything anymore? And they sort of changed, the Royal Navy changed their rules, and frigates just sort of went away. And frigates sort of kind of came back for World War II, but very haphazardly. We at one point, before the 1975 reclassification, we had patrol frigates, which were small, and then we had regular frigates, which were like destroyer leaders. But in June of 1975, we got rid of all the frigates. Everything that was classified as a frigate either became a destroyer or a cruiser, depending upon how big it was. And the BELKNAP became a cruiser. So now it's a cruiser. Later that year, it collided with the USS John F. Kennedy, which, if I remember correctly, the 22nd of November is the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. And so on that day, it collided with the John F. Kennedy. There were 7 fatalities. A bad fire. From what I understand, when it collided, it hit one of the aviation fuel tanks on the carrier and ripped a gash in it. And then, so it was dumping aviation fuel, or maybe bunker fuel, one of the two. It was dumping them down their stacks. And so that lit off. And so now you've got this huge fire, and you can see the damage there. It basically just melted away the entire superstructure. Now, she was still under power at this point. And she still had steerage, but she wasn't being steered from the bridge, obviously. And she did go into the shipyard and get extensive rebuilding afterwards. Now, I know somebody who was on board when that fire happened. In fact, he's mentioned in the report, although his name is redacted from the ones that you and I have access to. The reason why he's mentioned is one of those 7 guys that died, he was the last person who put eyes on him. He was in CIC when it happened, and basically everybody on one side of CIC, because CIC was right behind the bridge in the superstructure, everybody who was on one side of CIC died, and everybody who was on the other side of CIC lived. And Rick told me that he's in CIC, and another enlisted guy came running into the room from the bridge, and he said, "We're going to collide with the carrier." It's like, oh shit. And the guy turns around to leave, and they go, "Where are you going?" He goes, "I'm going to go back to the bridge and watch the collision." I don't know if that guy lived or not. But it was a bad day. It was a bad day. The captain was court-martialed, because court-martial really just means that there's a court of inquiry of some sort. It doesn't, that he's going to be court-martialed. It just means they're going to have a court. And so when they did that, the captain said, "Look, my night orders said don't do what he did." The officer of the deck explicitly violated orders. The orders said, don't try to turn inside the ship, turn to the outside, and then come back into formation. Do not try to stay in formation with the carrier when it's maneuvering. And the reason why the captain had given those orders was because he didn't think his officers could handle that their ship handling was good enough to maintain formation with the carrier. So he specifically told them, break formation, turn wide, and then come back in. This guy tried to maintain formation with the carrier, and apparently the captain was correct in his assessment of the ship handling capabilities. The captain was exonerated, but his career was still effectively over, which is not surprising. So the ironic thing about it was, so the ship ends up going into the shipyard, and she was in the shipyard for a long time, but she was supposed to go in and get an upgrade. I think it might have been the new threat upgrade. I'm not sure if that's it. New threat was a little bit later than that, so she might have been one of the first ships scheduled to go in for the new threat upgrade, which would have replaced, amongst other things, it would have replaced with her Terrier and Talos and Tartar missiles with SM-2s. But in any event, she was due to go into yard for an extensive modernization. The damage was so severe that they ended up having to, of course, cut away the entire superstructure. They assessed the condition of the ship, concluded it was salvageable, and built a new superstructure. And she got a much more extensive upgrade, and it was cheaper than it would have been otherwise, because all that stuff was demolished. They just cut it away and sent it off for scrap. They got lucky in that regard. But it was in the shipyard for a long time, which makes sense, because first you have to assess, is this ship seaworthy enough? Then you have to like cut away all the stuff. Then you have to decide what you're going to do. And and if they're going to do an upgrade, it's like, okay, we've got this opportunity. So they probably had to like redraw all the plans. They had to replan the upgrade and figure out what they were going to have to build. And then they'd have to schedule yard time to actually go in and do all that stuff. So she was in the yard for 5 or 6 years, something like that. The guy who told me about the collision, I think, told me that she effectively didn't go back into the fleet for like a decade as a result of this. Okay, so that was the historical Belknap. Let's talk about the Federation Starship Belknap. So here's a few views. These are by Addressel. And so that's sort of his typical color scheme. So anytime, I'm going to show you lots of illustrations that come from him that are in the same general format. So you can see it's got the warp engines, or the pylons are connected together and attach as a unit to the bottom of the secondary hull. This means that she's got a sort of flatter profile. She doesn't have the engines above the secondary hull. And the secondary hull is a little on the small side compared to, say, the secondary hull on a Constitution class. But that's the same primary hull as on a Constitution class, arranged pretty much the same way, right? As you can see, the neck, the dorsal support is a little bit longer than they stuck a phaser in the back there. They've extended that a little bit more compared to the Constitution class, but it's pretty similar until you get to the secondary hull, at which point you've got this smaller secondary hull and this sort of warp engine assembly. So there's an actual comparison with the Constitution class. You can see she's a little bit shorter, and a lot of that is just it basically boils down to the secondary hull's shorter, and the pylons attach farther up as a result of that. But if you measure those saucers, the saucers are the same size, and the engines are the same size. So I use the engines to sort of figure out what the scale of the ship was, because I figured the engines aren't going to change. The saucer might. I didn't think it was going to change, but both the saucer matches and the engines match. So the in-universe history is that there was this concept for this ship that was going to be called the Decatur, that was done sort of old school, original series type technology, that somebody proposed it at that point, but they never actually built it. Then the movie era comes along, and they decided to actually build it. Now, I don't think ever actually uttered these words, but I think at least until recently, up through the TNG era, you can make the argument that generations of Starfleet ships are defined by their engines. Everything from, all the capital ships, the big ships in the original series had the same engine. Movie era ships, like the Miranda and the Constitution refit class, they all have the same engine. You see the same engine being used a couple of times in Next Gen with the Enterprise D and with the Nebula. The Galaxy class and the Nebula class have the same engine. After that, it sort of seems to break down. I think the rule of cool is sort of taken over and people just design their own engines all the time. I like the idea that Starfleet develops an engine and sort of runs with it and then builds ships around those engines. And so originally this was proposed for the movie era or for the original series era. It didn't get built then, but then they did build a Decatur prototype, and it's clearly a prototype. It's clearly different. It has sort of in-universe, it's got inferior speed and endurance, and it's got more limited armament. You'll notice the obvious thing right away is that it doesn't have the photon torpedo tubes right above the main navigational deflector. But I think in universe, it also has fewer phasers. And it's just not quite as capable a ship. It's later upgraded so that it's closer to being a regular warship as opposed to, I mean, it was basically a test ship. And they decided it was worth doing, but they added a bunch of stuff. They upgraded it so that it was closer to being the same as, turn this off, the same as the rest of the class, but it was still unique. It wasn't quite as good. It didn't have everything that the rest of the class had, and they basically used it as a training ship. You need training ships too. And it had a modern fit. It had a modern gear, modern sensors, modern engines, et cetera, so that would make it a good training ship. So in universe, the idea is that this is intended as a cheaper complement to the Constitution class. That's what they said. Cheaper complement. It's a cheaper complement that supposedly has the same capabilities, except where it's superior. It's supposed to be faster. It's supposed to be a fair amount faster. And it's also better armed. But it's cheaper. It's got the same capabilities, but it's cheaper and it's better armed. And there might have been an endurance hit that I'm not remembering off the top of my head. It occurred to me that I don't specifically remember if it said that the endurance was different. But they said it was supposed to be a cheaper complement, and then all the other words after that did not scream cheaper to me. It really didn't. And it has what they refer to as a routine detachable engine assembly. The idea is that you can basically blow the explosive bolts or whatever is holding that thing on, and the engines just sort of float away. Okay. The question is, why is that a feature? I'm not sure that I fully understand why that would be a feature, but that's part of the background. So a few observations about routine detachable does not mean routinely detached. I think it just means that, like, if they have warp engine damage for whatever reason, they can do a swap out relatively quickly. They can just sort of detach the entire assembly, bring the new one on, attach it, do whatever calibration and balancing they have to do, and they're ready to rock and roll again. So, okay, I can see that as being potentially useful if they think they're going to take damage. They can sort of swap out the engines and go for it right away. When I first saw the design, it sort of implied to me that maybe the warp core is at the bottom of the secondary hull. That just sort of seemed to me, but the shape doesn't quite seem to support that. And so we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. I do think that the engine placement lends itself to modifications. And we see a couple of those in the form of the ATHABASKA and the Ascension class. So because of where the engines are, they don't get in the way of wanting to hang other stuff on the primary hull. And so you can put other stuff in the primary hull, you can swap the primary hull, and you don't have to worry about it interfering with the engines. Unlike the Constitution class, where some of that stuff kind of gets in the way. So I think from that standpoint, okay, this says to me that it's a design that has a lot of potential, at least in theory. And some of what we see and sort of the follow-on designs are about it living up to that potential. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple of things that came up real quick. Randall Wong says DD-251 Belknap did the DD service and changed to a seaplane tender, then a DD transport for World War II. A lot of those 4 Pipers became a transport because their engines were very modular. And if you were willing to give up the speed, you could just take out a boiler, a couple of boilers, and just pop it right out in a fuel bunker, etc., and put in troop quarters or whatever, and it was very easy. Mark Plott says, which is canon, Constitution 2 class or Enterprise class? Your guess is as good as mine, because I've seen both used extensively, and I suspect that there might actually, maybe there's an answer on which one's canon. I have a tendency to kind of go with Constitution 2, or I usually say Constitution refit, even though I'm sure some of them were new builds, they weren't refits. And considering how extensive the rebuild was on Enterprise, I don't know why they did a rebuild. Well, I know that in the original plan for the movie was that wasn't a refit. It was a new ship, that they were going to take a new ship out. And apparently that's what the movie makers wanted to do, but the studio said, but the Enterprise is your most important character. You can't kill the Enterprise. Okay, well, they later did kill the Enterprise. They lived with it, and they came up with the idea that maybe you could have a new ship that just sort of looked like the old ship, and then you can just recycle the name, and the fans will be okay with that. But it took them a while to sort of, they had to go through all the stages of grief before they could get to acceptance on that. So, okay. So let's take a look at the plans for this thing. Now, I forget who did these plans. I want to say it was not Todd Guenther. It's not like Todd Platkin or something like that. You can find this stuff on Cygnus X1. Did I mention Cygnus X1? It's on Cygnus X1. And there's the entire book of plans from the top deck to the bottom deck. There's the whole thing is there. I did not, we're not going to go through the entire thing because most of it is just Mark 1 Mod 0 Federation starship from the movie era. There's nothing real special about anything that's going on in the primary hull. It's all just standard. The real, I think the money shot is the side view cutaway, and we're going to do that in just a second. In fact, I think we're going to do it right now. Okay, so this is just sort of the general scene setter on this. I probably should make it a little bit bigger when I redo these slides because I could extend it out just a little bit more. But, you know, if you need to freeze the video and expand it, or better yet, just go to Cygnus X1 and you can get your own copy of this. But it's a nice little cutaway. I agree with you, Mark. It's a nice little cutaway. It's a nice ship. And let's take a look at it a little bit more detail, specifically the part we care about, or the part I care about, which is all this stuff going on here in the secondary hull. So the very top, you can see those balls are a classic line of fusion engines. So I mean, that just says impulse array, right? That's the impulse engines right there. On the left-hand side, you've got a vertical warp core with antimatter bottles at the bottom, readily ejectable. If you go back to the Starfleet Dynamics book, it shows how all the different starships, and you can get that on Cygnus X1. Did I mention Cygnus X1? You can get it on Cygnus X1. Starfleet Dynamics has a thing where it talks about all the different warp bottle configurations that Federation starships have and how they eject in the whole bit. And then you can see that there's a warp core that comes down, and then it turns horizontal and goes over, and then it goes vertical again and goes down into the mechanism whereby the engines are connected, the pylon assembly down there. That thing that follows the spine of the dorsal, that big thick conduit, is actually a Jeffries tube. And there's one at the very front. There's a Jeffries tube that goes along the very vertical Jeffries tube. You can see it. It's on the very left-hand side. But that thing going down the spine is also a vertical Jeffries tube, and it goes all the way down to the connector down there. And so let's throw some lines on to make it a little easier. So the yellow path is the path of warp plasma. And I'll note the navigational deflector area seems kind of sparse. I would expect a large assembly in back. Now remember, I don't remember when these exact blueprints were done. The original ship design dates back to 1984. So Wrath of Khan was out. Star Trek 3 came out in 1984, so it probably was not even informed by Star Trek 3. It was probably just Wrath of Khan. And so we didn't have all the internal schematics that have big navigational assemblies coming back. That all comes from Sternbach. So we don't have that big structure there. I would expect to see a little bit more there. And I would expect, if it was being done today, you'd expect more, and you'd expect there to be an explicit conduit that takes warp plasma to wherever that thing is, because that thing uses huge amounts of power. It's reaching long distances and knocking asteroids and stuff out of the way. So it uses a lot of power. So it's kind of missing there. So maybe there's a better way to do this. And one option that occurred to me is, why am I limited to vertical and horizontal? Why couldn't I just do it at an angle and connect the assembly, the engine assembly at the bottom directly to like where the impulse deflection crystal is at the top? Well, I suppose I could. If I want to run plasma to the navigational deflector, I'm going to have a long sort of thing out. So I first thought about that, and the more I thought about it, the more I went, okay, that's going to get in the way of everything. The advantage of the design as originally presented was the vertical warp core sort of like off to one side. I mean, it's far forward, so you got it's not getting in the way. This diagonal thing is going to kind of get in the way of a lot of the other stuff you might want to put in there. Like, as I've got it, it's running right through the shuttle bay, and so it's like I don't know why you would do that. It doesn't necessarily make sense to me after all. Okay, but maybe you could do something like this. You'd have a vertical component. You'd have a short little thing that extends forward to the navigational deflector, and then go back to the array, the assembly. Okay, that might work, but still, that diagonal component, I think, is still kind of getting in the way. Well, maybe if you moved it down at the bottom, and I guess it probably still would have a little spiky thing sticking out going to the navigational array. I forgot to include that. If you moved it down to the bottom, you might be able to get sort of a little bit straighter shot there. But I'm not sure that works, because if the antimatter bottles are down there, the mixing is taking place up higher, I think, and I'm not sure that works either. So I went into this exercise thinking, I don't like the fact that it goes down and then it goes horizontal and then it goes vertical again. I just didn't like that. The more I played around with it, though, the more I kind of went, that might actually be the best after all. That might actually work best. And so, as much as I hate it, I kind of think that original configuration is the best. It has the advantage that it buries the warp core as deep in the hull as you can get it, so it's more protected. If you put it down at the very bottom, it's right near the skin of the ship, and so in theory, Khan or somebody else can take a shot and actually hit your warp core. That would probably be bad. It allows an efficient use of space, because it's not, if it goes diagonal, it's cutting across a lot of different things. So I kind of decided that all the other ideas that I came up with had drawbacks that were serious enough that I kind of decided that I was okay with the original after all. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, the solution to it, if you really did want to change that, is probably to change where the warp pylons connect. I am unconvinced that the entire routine detachable is useful enough to design around. I don't understand why you would do that. I mean, yeah, I guess it's useful if you took damage and you needed to, or you wanted to upgrade the engines or something like that. You could just sort of swap them out like that. But as it is, you can detach them in the pylon. You don't have to, and it just means you detach them separately as opposed to detaching them as a unit. And so I actually kind of like that top warp engine pylon assembly. I think that actually kind of works pretty good, and I think that would work well on the BELKNAP. And the navigational deflector in the BELKNAP is high in the secondary hull, and so it's just about at the point where that top engine pylon design would extend. If you just sort of extend the pylons, it would go right about the center of the navigational deflector. So you can make the argument, like I showed you at the very beginning, you can make the argument that there's a warp core that comes straight back from that navigational deflector. And it's it's a horizontal thing, and then the warp engines would attach to it, and you don't have to have all this jinking around stuff that you did in those blueprints. So now I don't know if you ask Todd Guenther or whoever, the original design's like 40 years old now. If you asked any of the people that did drawings on it, where do you think the warp core is? I'm not sure that any of them have thought about it at all. Those blueprints are just one guy's interpretation of it, right? It's typical fandom. Somebody decided to draw blueprints, so he drew blueprints. But I kind of like the idea of like moving the pylon assembly. I like the idea of the low engines. I'm not sure that I quite like the bottom pylon as much as I would like this pylon assembly. So this show's actually gone a lot faster than I thought it was going to. Next week's show is going to be about the Ascension class dreadnought plus the Federation class, which is the classic one that you see from Franz Joseph with the third nacelle coming out of the primary hull. And then there's the version that Todd Guenther and some other people have done for the movie era. And there is specifically an article that compares and contrasts that version with this version, the Ascension class, which was proposed as being like a way to get a dreadnought on the cheap. Dreadnoughts in this universe, the defining characteristic seems to be having a third nacelle for whatever reason. And then as long as we're looking at those, there's some other three nacelle monstrosities out there. We see the three nacelle Galaxy version from, I think that's from the series finale, if I remember correctly. We see there's the USS Triton from the space flight chronology, which is a failed design because they didn't understand the warp dynamics. They thought a third nacelle would be useful, and it turns out it wasn't. It's sort of interesting. You don't see three nozzle rocket designs because it turns out that a three nozzle rocket design doesn't work very well. If you lose one engine, you've got problems. You've got some stability problems. You're actually better off with four engines than three, and you're better off with two than three. So it sort of works with this as well, I guess. And then the week after that, we'll take a look at the ATHABASKA class, which is listed as an exploration cruiser. It's an exploration cruiser that basically replaces the primary hull of the BELKNAP with a Knox-class frigate primary hull, complete with the mega phaser assemblies up above. So for a ship with the word exploration in its job title, it's got an awful lot of firepower. So if you told me ATHABASKA class battle cruiser, that would make a lot of sense to me. And so we're going to look at the Knox class, and we're going to look at the internal arrangement where some people did a blueprint on it. They think they know where the warp core is. Let's take a look at where the warp core is on that, where the warp core is on the Miranda class, which some of the fan sources, the fans got stuff out on that ship before we got an official canon name for it. So if you see Avenger class, that means it's a fandom produced thing that occurred before we found out that in universe, in canon, it's called the Miranda class. And so so we're going to take a look at the Avenger class blueprints as well, and how they differ from the Knox class, and then how the Knox class figures into all this. And as sort of a think about this going forward, when you think about both the Miranda and the Knox, where's the warp core? How does warp plasma get to those engines? Because there's those big landing bays in the back, and the engines basically attach right underneath the landing bay. Where's the warp core? And how does that change in this thing? Well, it certainly simplifies things because it takes the warp core out of what would be the primary hull. Doesn't need to be there. It can be in the secondary hull. And so potentially it opens up some more space. So it's not, strictly speaking, just a Knox class. It's a Knox class that has probably some extra space in it. But I'll talk about all that. So let's see. SpaceX Starship uses 6 engines, more than 6. It's got a lot. Let's see. ATHABASKA has a split warp core. Is there a source for that, or is that just your hypothesis, Mark, that it has a split warp core? I'll wait for you to put something down. Let me go back up and take a look at what other people have said. Let's see. The Enterprise is a Constitution. Patrick Ross says the Enterprise is a Constitution refit, like the Super Hornet is an F-18 variant. Yeah, they just look alike when you sort of like look at them in general. If you put 2 of them side by side, the differences just scream. And if you put an overlay of one on top of the other, like a outline of one on top of the other, the first time I saw an outline of a Super Hornet on top of a regular Hornet, my immediate thought was the Navy lied to Congress and got away with it. They managed to convince Congress that this was actually a Super Hornet, or that this was a Hornet variant, because it's not really a Hornet variant. Okay, so Patrick Ross says next what happened there? Okay, I clicked something by accident, and I don't know what's going on there. Oh, hold on a second. There we go. They've been adding all sorts of stuff to StreamYard, and you can accidentally click stuff, and stuff happens, and so that's what was going on there. Patrick Ross says, next we'll be asking why they have rocks in the ceiling. So it's funny, like whenever they take damage on the bridge, rocks fall out of the ceiling. It's like, why do they do that? I think it's supposed to be insulation. I don't understand why insulation would be falling out of the ceiling like that either. Let's see, scrolling down. Okay. So Mark says that the ATHABASKA has a split warp core, and it's from Jackals. So I've got the Jackal stuff. I haven't had a chance to look up ATHABASKA on that yet, because I was actually out of town. I left town yesterday, came back, got back in town about 2 o'clock today. Had most of this presentation done, but did have to sort of assemble it. I had all the parts, and I need to go back and look at Jackals. So that'll be something I'll do after the show tonight. So Vic Kaufman says 70s craftsmanship. Yep, 70s craftsmanship. I like that a lot. Vic, glad you can make it. Oh, that's an interesting theory. So Olive says, I have a theory that those materials do that because it's better than spalling. Yeah, I could see that. I think I wonder why they would be taking spalling damage either, though, because while they're taking hits, nothing seems to be physically impacting the hull. But that's an interesting thought. Maybe that's because maybe it's absorbing something. Maybe it's basically a spray-on armor layer, and you just pop the armor off. Oh, that's interesting. Mark says, so I know I'll need to go into this, that the Miranda portion, which is actually a Nox portion, it's not quite a Miranda, is independent from the star drive with a single warp core. So that basically the idea is that it can, although why does it have a warp core if it doesn't have warp engines? All right, I'm going to have to do some research on that. And I'm looking forward to doing that research because this ship I kind of like. Those of you who've been around for a while will remember that there's a lot of times where I brought in some fan designs or something that if you really, really want to get me excited about a Star Trek ship, have big mission module bays. And there's that one ship that has the 2 secondary hulls, not the Geronimo from Axanar, but there's another one that has 2 secondary hulls and a sort of a structure connecting the two. And I just started salivating over, like, I just think of everything you could do with that much extra space. That's one of the reasons why I really like this design and why I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about it, is that you can look at it as having 3 hangar bays. I kind of look at it as having 3 multi-mission bays, which can be used for some sort of spacecraft, but don't have to be. They can be used for something else. They can carry gear that you're going to deposit on a planet or whatever. There's all sorts of things you can do. You give me a big space like that and I can do stuff with it. So, okay. I thought for a while there we were going to do a show under an hour. I don't know that. I think we've had exactly 1 show, maybe 2 that has been under an hour. But with the questions usually extend it by 10 minutes or so. And here we are at an hour and 2 minutes. So with that in mind, though, I think I'm done for. I think we're done for today. And so
what?
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? Lissa always gives me shit about how the 1 hour show always goes a minimum of an hour and 20, and it's more likely to go an hour and 40 than it is to go an hour and 20. Okay, roger that. I'll own that. But I am always amazed that people come and spend their Saturday night listening to me talk about stuff. And as long as you guys keep doing it, I'll keep doing it too. So thank you very much for coming and doing that. And I'm looking forward to doing next week's show and the week after that and all the shows in the future after that too. So, but thank you very much, everybody. And I will see you next week. Probably.